I am not sure if reading the email newsletter that is dutifully sent out every week is a practice that has fallen by the wayside in pandemic times. That being said, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for everyone who received their newsletter, opened it up, and read that the upcoming title of my sermon was Welcome to the Apocalypse. I am a linguist by training, and I understand wording and phrasing can bring about a myriad of different reactions, as I'm sure was the result in this case. I feel it necessary and appropriate to insert a disclaimer at this point in my sermon. Please know that in the time since I have last preached here and since moving further west to New Mexico, I have not gone off the deep end and become one of those preachers who stands on a street corner with a bullhorn and wearing a sign that says the end is nigh. Also rest assured that this is not going to be one of those sermons either. The word apocalypse is one of those heavily charged religious words that intimidate people whenever it is seen or spoken. Often, that fear is turned into a commodity for some sort of monetary gain, such as Hollywood and television shows like American Horror Story, using it in the title of their shows or movies to entice people to tune in or buy a ticket and watch. It is also a word that is used by some churches to use the fear that it conjures up to illustrate why it is essential to adopt certain doctrinal positions that have often been used to do more trauma and harm than they have done any good. Regardless of the context in which it is applied, it is a word that makes this UU candidate squirm because it evokes images of fire and brimstone and the end of the world that do not fit into how I view the world or come to understand theology. While it is true that the word apocalypse is usually reserved for a particular genre of religious literature that includes these themes, as well as other aspects of supernatural imagery, the word apocalypse itself comes from two Greek words, apo and kalypto, which both mean unveiling or unraveling. The idea is that apocalyptic literature would illustrate how the divine would overcome the forces of the world that were causing grief and torment, and reveal a new world and a new future that would be ushered in. Believe it or not, apocalyptic literature was meant as a sign of hope for those who were suffering under persecution. It was a way to let them know that the divine was still out there and at work in the world, and that we as a people would be led to better and more prosperous times. When understood this way, I feel like the concept of apocalypse becomes much more relatable and not so scary. If I am being honest, my entire journey through seminary and the process of ministerial formation to being on the cusp of serving a congregation has been a series of small apocalypses on a daily basis. My eyes have been opened not only to things that I did not know before or did not understand about religion and theology, but how it functions in relation to people and how it can have an impact on their daily lives. And while I would say that the majority of what I have seen and witnessed has been positive, life-giving, and wholeness-creating, I would be lying if I said I had not noticed several difficult issues and challenges along the way. What is even more frustrating is that as I approach what is hopefully the end of the road towards becoming a minister, there is an expectation, whether held by other people or whether I have internalized it and placed it upon myself, that by this point, I have this whole religion and theology thing figured out, and that I now have all the answers of all the above mentioned difficult issues and challenges along the way. This is, of course, a very naive assumption to have, and one that I have accepted could not be further from the truth. I've been pleasantly surprised at how much that I'm still learning and still finding difficult moments with which I have had to wrestle and struggle. One of the most unexpected moments came at the hands of a class entitled Sexuality and Pastoral Practice at Bright Divinity School. One of the first books the professor asked us to read was the book Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God by Kelly Brown Douglas. The book, which was written after the verdict acquitting George Zimmerman from shooting and killing Trayvon Martin, was written by Douglas, who was raising a 13-year-old son at the time, about what kinds of things she was to teach her son about what the society in which he is living has to say about the value, or lack of value, of Black and brown bodies, and the history behind the culture of why it has become acceptable within our current white majority culture to stand your ground and seek to defend yourself with deadly force when presented with the supposed threat of a Black and brown body standing before you. Douglas spends most of the book analyzing the history of the Anglo-Saxon myth, of how white European bodies and their culture came to be viewed as not only superior and morally exemplary for the newly emerging United States, but also preordained as chosen by God as having the rights to be superior over other races and cultures. This is not anything new to me. I have met many uncomfortable moments over the past few years over becoming aware and ashamed of the white privilege that I have and from which I have benefited. I have made and continue to make efforts to try and name my white privilege and to deconstruct it, although it has often resulted in finding out that as much of it as I deconstruct, the more of it that I realize that I have. I am also aware of the fact that much of the early history of the United States is fundamentally wrapped up in issues of racial superiority, courtesy of our so-called founding fathers. But what I was not prepared for was the appearance of two names that I have often championed in sermons as leaders in the great Unitarian Universalist history of social justice: Ralph Waldo Emerson and Theodore Parker. Regarding the issue of racial superiority, Emerson was quoted in his book English Traits as saying that even though the English are of a mixed origin, they are, quote, collectively a better race than any from which they are derived, and that they are the best stock in the world, suggesting that while he may have held the romantic ideal that led him to stress the inherent value of humans, he certainly did not believe that all of them were equal. Although he was an ardent abolitionist and thought that Black bodies should be freed from slavery, he did not go as far to say that Black and white bodies were to be viewed as equal. Theodore Parker was more explicit and more insidious in his racial epithets. Parker was quoted as saying that, quote, the Caucasian differs from all other races. He is humane, he is civilized and progressive. In another of his sermons, he wrote that the Anglo-Saxon is a good hardy stock for national welfare to grow on. Human nature had never anything so good for popular liberty to be grafted into. These statements from both men would help to feed into the culture of American exceptionalism that would become the prevailing social attitude through the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th century until the legislation of the civil rights era in the 1960s. I admitted in our class discussion after the reading that I had formally introduced myself to everyone in seminary as a self-professed, loud, out, and proud Unitarian Universalist. But after reading Douglas's words and the words of Emerson and Parker, I was no longer sure if I could claim the proud part of that moniker. There were many questions circling around within my head. Chief among them was, how am I to stand for a denomination that actively fights for social justice and proclaims Black Lives Matter when the very white men that we lift up as heroes of our Unitarian Universalist faith and morals are the same ones responsible for bringing about the society in which we have to proclaim Black Lives Matter in the first place? I have become all too aware of the many publicized issues that the UUA has undergone in recent years on issues of race. While many have said that this can be traced back to events which happened at GAs in the 1960s and 1970s, I would say that we need to be looking back much further in our history to understand our complex history on issues of race. I also began to wonder how I, as a white ministerial candidate that was still trying to struggle and overcome his own personal white privilege, was to speak for and represent a denomination that has issues of racial superiority and white supremacy within its own history as well. To put it mildly, I was in the midst of my own existential apocalypse from which I was having difficulty seeing how I was to break free. So what do we do? What is the solution for us as a people who look to do the work of social justice and change the course of our society for the better? The all too common response from many in my generation would be to do nothing. They would wash their hands of it, proclaim that was not who they were, and simply walk away, leaving the church and religion itself behind, never to return. Perhaps it is because I am too much of an optimist, or because I have too much faith in humanity, but I could not find a way of bringing myself to do that. What I am suggesting, however, as someone who is admittedly still trying to find the answers, is to employ the use of a common phrase that I heard often in seminary, the concept of living in the tension. Many people, especially those who consider themselves to be members of churches that call themselves liberal and progressive, often think that because we are part of church communities that are working and advocating toward issues of social justice, that other larger systemic issues such as racism are ones that we no longer have to worry about. To adopt such a position is to find ourselves as continuing to support a system of white privilege. To be truly effective in advocating social justice causes and combating and dismantling systems of oppression, we need to be open and upfront about the very fact that we have at times contributed and promoted to those very systems of oppression through our history, that we have not always gotten it right, and that we have done much that has caused harm to many Black and brown bodies throughout history. It is exactly because of the complicity that we have shown in contributing to these systems of oppression that forms the reason behind why we should continue to fight for social justice causes. It is in learning through the mistakes that we have made that we learn to find the strength and energy to overcome them, to make the world right, and to change the world for the better of ourselves and future generations to come, much like the son to which Kelly Brown Douglas was writing in her book. In the end, pardon the pun, as terrifying as the concept of arriving at the apocalypse might be, the result is cathartic in a way. It shows us that amid the bleakest of solutions where no hope can be found, and it feels like giving up is the best possible option because it all seems too much, there is the moment of uncovering that comes with an apocalypse. We are able to see the ways in which we are able to move forward toward both hope and wholeness to find the better world that we strive to create. It is scary, it is messy, it is painful, it is frustrating. And most importantly, it is the work that we are called upon to do. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen. Shalom. Assalamu alaikum. Namaste. Thank you all so much. It is a pleasure to be back in blessed community with you again.